From tragic accidents to natural disasters and all of the terrible things humans have done in between, here are the top 10 terrifying historical predictions that came true. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the Titanic. We have all heard about the Titanic and the tragedy that ensued when, in 1912, it struck an iceberg and began to sink as a result. 1,517 people died in the icy waters following this incident, but what if I told you that there was an eerie prediction that predated the Titanic's debut sail? In 1898, Morgan Robertson's book Futility was published, also known as The Wreck of the Titan. Would you believe that the premise of this story is about an apparently unsinkable boat that is called the Titan that ends up sinking after hitting an iceberg? Like, seriously. The Titan and the Titanic, unsinkable but ends up sinking after striking an iceberg, it's almost too much. Turns out that it was simply just pure coincidence, and apparently the author was an experienced sailor, and as he saw the ships getting larger and larger, he figured it was just a matter of time before one of these large vessels came into contact with an exceptionally dangerous situation like the one he wrote about. In our number 9 spot today, we have the atomic bomb. It wasn't until 1945 when the very first atomic bomb was dropped, and that was on Hiroshima, Japan on August 6th of that year, with the second coming just a few days after over Nagasaki. Until those at the Manhattan Project really started to create these weapons of mass destruction, we could never have dreamed of something so destructive, powerful, and terrifying. Well, unless you're H.G. Wells, of course. In his 1914 novel The World Set Free, Wells details the disaster that follows an atomic explosion. Wells used known scientific facts at the time to inform his novel, but at the time it was written, no one knew about the power that had yet to be created. He wrote about the power of this futuristic weapon and said, quote, "Perished museums, cathedrals, palaces, libraries, galleries of masterpieces, and a vast accumulation of human achievement whose charred remains lie buried." It wasn't until 30 years later that this type of power would actually come to fruition, and now, over 100 years after this book was written, atomic and nuclear power are a topic of everyday conversation. In our number 8 spot today, we have James Dean. James Dean is one of Hollywood's most famous actors ever, despite his untimely death when he was just 24 years old. On September 30th, 1955, James was speeding in his Porsche 550 Spyder when he unfortunately crashed into another car traveling the opposite direction and lost his life. This is a terrible and tragic story, and here's where the eerie prediction part comes in. Just 7 days before this death, James met with celebrated actor Alec Guinness to show off his new car. Alec apparently just suddenly had a terrible dark feeling, and he told James, quote, "Please do not get into that car, because if you do, by 10 o'clock at night next Thursday, you'll be dead." This means that he somehow not only predicted James' imminent death, but also the exact day it would occur on. In our number 7 spot today, we have World War II. When World War I ended, although I wasn't there, I feel like people were probably looking forward to living their lives outside of a world war, and were not necessarily anticipating another one to be right around the corner. I mean, it was called the War to End All Wars, but apparently French general and military theorist Ferdinand Foch wasn't exactly buying it. Apparently, according to Winston Churchill, when Ferdinand learned about the peace treaty with Versailles, he was extremely upset about it. He was upset that Germany was remaining intact, and he apparently said to Churchill that the ending of the war was not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Well, that turned out to be frighteningly true when World War II began 20 years and 68 days later. Ferdinand passed away in 1929, so he didn't get to see his prediction come to fruition, and although that would have been an "I told you so" moment, no one would want to brag about having a horrible prediction like that come true. In our number 6 spot today, we have the climate. If you're one of those people who is sensitive to the topic of climate change, you might want to skip over this one because I don't want anyone fighting in the comments. The 1800s are widely regarded as the golden age of industrialization, but when we think of this time, we also think of the smoggy world that also existed in this newly mechanized world. We now know all about the damages to the environment this was causing, but at the time, no one really knew about these sorts of things, and no one really ever took a moment to actually consider the consequences. Well, other than George Perkin Marsh. George was a congressman from Vermont, and he was way ahead of his time when he began mentioning the potential downsides of our harm to the environment. Actually, he predicted that human intervention on the Earth's natural resources would eventually cause the temperature of the planet to rise. While our modern understanding of climate change is far more complex because we understand more than we did then, it's eerie to hear of warnings coming from that long ago. In our number 5 spot today, we have government spying. We now live in a world where people are constantly paranoid about the possibility of the government spying on them through the technology that we hold at our fingertips. People are always talking about our security and our privacy, and it makes sense. It's something that is extremely important, but these talks have been around since long before the kind of technology we have nowadays. In fact, in the earliest days of computer making, the pioneers of computing have long predicted the idea of secret organizations like the CIA using computers to install police systems, and these predictions have their roots all the way back in the 70s. That's wild because the first personal computer, which was by IBM, wasn't introduced until 1981. Even before the product actually existed, people were predicting where the technology would take us. In some ways, they certainly were right. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Great Fire of London. When it comes to predictions, Nostradamus is one of the most prominent names that comes up. It is said that he was able to predict a whole slew of things before they happened, and while some predictions might be a little murkier than others, one prediction was quite terrifyingly accurate. One of his predictions in his book of prophecies said, quote, "The blood of the just will be lacking in London, burnt up in the fire of 66. The ancient lady will topple from her high place, many of the same sect will be killed." This book was written in 1555, so imagine everyone's horror when the Great London Fire happened in 1666. From September 2nd to the 5th of that year, London was engulfed in fire and it absolutely decimated the city. 13,000 homes were destroyed along with landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral. As it turns out, this Nostradamus prediction may have been more accurate than any of us are comfortable with. It's really just the accurate year that gets me super creeped out. In our number 3 spot today, we have stone tablets. Japan is located in an area of the world that is geographically constantly volatile. I mean, the area is known as the Ring of Fire, and the residents of Japan are certainly no strangers to destructive earthquakes, and considering the whole island thing, subsequently devastating tsunamis as well. Throughout the years, and through a sort of trial and error scenario, residents of Japan in history have tried to warn about the volatile conditions with stone tablets. The tablets have engravings in them that warn any future occupant of the island not to build anything below a certain point. I love this because I think it's the sweetest thing that people of the past wanted to help out all of the people to come. I don't know, I don't feel like I have that kind of camaraderie with anyone, even the people I work with, let alone people who don't even exist yet. I love to see it. These stone tablets were quite impressive as well, with some towering over 10 feet tall, and they date back as early as the 6th century, which makes them an awesome but eerie part of history. In our number 2 spot today, we have Deniers. World War II is an extremely dark spot in terms of human history, and thankfully some people had the foresight before it ended to know that there would be people who would later try and deny the atrocities that occurred. When the Allies invaded mainland Europe near the end of the war, the supreme leader of the Allied forces and the future US President, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his troops went through the concentration camps that, at the time, people had only heard of, but they truly had no idea what was waiting for them. The reason they did this was because Eisenhower knew that if he were to ever be in the position where someone was trying to deny anything, he would be able to give his first-hand recount of the horrors he witnessed. If anyone wanted to try and twist the truth, he would be able to set it straight, and as soon as he saw what was really inside of the camps, he immediately called London and New York and asked them to send as many journalists and photographers as possible so that everyone would know exactly what happened inside of the camps. Unfortunately, he was right, and people did try and deny or twist the truths in order to escape punishment, but the world already knew. In our number 1 spot today, we have a security update. After the day of the September 11th attacks in 2001, airport security was changed forever. There are many changes that have come since, but the most obvious one is all of the security measures that now take place. It's truly for the best, but it came out of absolute tragedy. One of the security measures that was implemented was the installation of the cockpit being able to lock from the inside. This of course was to prevent any intruders from being able to take control of the plane. Unfortunately, however, people have used this security update to their advantage and have used it to harm people. In 2015, a German pilot locked his co-pilot out of the cockpit and then hijacked his own plane and crashed it into the French Alps because he wanted to take his own life. This is a terribly sad and tragic situation, and unfortunately just 2 months prior, someone had predicted this terrible outcome. A pilot by the name of Jan Crockett predicted that this new security system, which of course has only the best intentions, could ultimately prove worse for the pilot. He apparently said, quote, "I seriously wonder who's sitting next to me. I hope I never find myself in the situation where I go to the toilet and return to find a cockpit door that won't open." That is an absolutely terrifying thought, and it's eerie that the quote came just before that terrible situation. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye. But the most obvious ones are, but the most obvious one is all the way back in the,